I was sitting in a federal courthouse in downtown Tampa when my phone buzzed with a call from my mom's neighbor, Mrs. Chen. That call changed everything, and by everything, I mean it unleashed a level of legal fury that would make the Lakewood Estates Homeowner Association wish they had chosen a different elderly woman to terrorize. My name is Marcus Sullivan, and I prosecute federal fraud cases for the Middle District of Florida. I have spent the last 12 years putting away con artists, embezzlers, and scam operations that prey on vulnerable people. My job has made me intimately familiar with every trick in the book, every manipulation tactic, and every fraudulent scheme imaginable. So when Mrs. Chen told me that my 73-year-old mother was in her driveway crying over an eviction notice, something in my gut told me this was going to be bad. I left the courthouse immediately, telling my paralegal to reschedule my afternoon meetings. The drive from downtown Tampa to my mother's house in Lakewood Estates normally took about 30 minutes, but I made it in 20. My mother, Dorothy Sullivan, had lived in that house for 15 years, ever since my father passed away. She had paid off the mortgage 3 years ago and lived on a fixed income from Social Security and my father's pension. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for new neighbors, volunteered at the local library, and never missed a payment on anything in her entire life. When I pulled up to her modest 3-bedroom ranch house, I found her sitting on the front steps with Mrs. Chen's arm around her shoulders. My mom's eyes were red and puffy, and she was clutching a piece of paper in her trembling hands. The sight of my mother like that ignited something primal in me, but I forced myself to stay calm and professional. "Mom, what happened?" I asked, kneeling down beside her. She handed me the paper without saying a word. It was printed on official-looking letterhead that read Lakewood Estates HOA at the top. The document was titled Notice of Eviction and Foreclosure Proceedings in bold red letters. As I read through it, my blood pressure rose with each sentence. The notice claimed that my mother owed $17,432 in unpaid HOA fees, special assessments, late penalties, and legal fees. It stated that she had exactly 72 hours to pay the full amount or vacate the premises before the HOA would take possession of the property and change the locks. The tone was aggressive and threatening, filled with legal-sounding language designed to intimidate someone without legal knowledge. "Mom, have you been paying your HOA fees?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Every month, Marcus, every single month." "I have the canceled checks and bank statements to prove it." Her voice was shaky but determined. "I have never missed a payment, never." Mrs. Chen nodded vigorously. "Your mother is the most responsible person I know. This is nonsense. That horrible woman from the HOA has been harassing several people in the neighborhood." "What woman?" I asked, my prosecutor instincts kicking in. "Brenda Hutchins. She became the HOA president about 8 months ago, and she has been making everyone's life miserable. She fines people for the smallest things, sends threatening letters, and has been trying to force several elderly residents to sell their homes." I examined the eviction notice more carefully. Something was off about it immediately. First, in Florida, an HOA cannot simply evict a homeowner. They can place a lien on the property and eventually foreclose, but that process takes months and requires multiple court filings and notifications. Second, the letterhead looked professional, but when I looked closely, I could see that the font was slightly inconsistent, and the logo was pixelated, suggesting it had been created on a home computer rather than professionally printed. Third, there was no case number, no court information, and no attorney listed, which would be required for any legitimate foreclosure proceeding. "Mom, this is fake," I said firmly. "This is not a legal document. Someone is trying to scam you." "But it looks so official," she whispered. "And Brenda said that if I did not pay immediately, I would lose the house." "Brenda gave this to you personally?" She came to the door this morning with another woman. They were very aggressive. They said I had been ignoring their notices for months, but Marcus, I never received any notices. The first time I heard about any of this was today. I stood up and pulled out my phone. I need to make some calls. Mom, go inside and gather every piece of documentation you have related to the HOA, every canceled check, every receipt, every email or letter, everything, Mrs. Chen helped my mother inside while I called my office. My colleague, Jennifer Ramirez, answered on the second ring. Jennifer was one of the best investigators in our division with a particular talent for unraveling financial fraud schemes. Jen, I need you to run a background check on someone named Brenda Hutchins. She is the HOA president at Lakewood Estates in Tampa. I also need you to pull any corporate filings for the Lakewood Estates Homeowner Association. Something fraudulent is going on and I need to know exactly what we are dealing with. On a Sunday, she asked, this is personal. Someone is trying to scam my mother out of her house. Say no more, give me 2 hours. I ended the call and went inside. My mother had spread out 15 years' worth of meticulous financial records on her dining room table. She had every canceled check, every bank statement, and every receipt organized in chronological order. As I went through them, I confirmed what I already knew. She had never missed a single HOA payment. The monthly fee was $150 and she had paid it like clockwork on the first of every month. Mom, these records are perfect. You have done nothing wrong. This is completely fraudulent. But what do they want? Why are they doing this? That was the question that gnawed at me. I called the phone number listed on the fake eviction notice and a woman answered on the third ring. Lakewood Estates HOA, Brenda speaking. Her voice was sharp and nasal, with an undertone of barely concealed irritation. I could practically hear the entitlement dripping from every word. This is Marcus Sullivan. I am calling about the eviction notice that was delivered to my mother, Dorothy Sullivan, this morning. Oh, you must be the son. Well, your mother owes a substantial amount of money to this community, and we will not tolerate delinquent homeowners any longer. If she cannot afford to live here, she needs to sell. The casual cruelty in her voice was stunning. I took a breath and kept my tone measured. I am looking at my mother's financial records right now, and she has paid every HOA fee on time for 15 years. Can you please explain what these alleged charges are for? I do not have to explain anything to you. The notice clearly itemizes everything. Your mother has 72 hours to pay or vacate. If you want to dispute it, you can hire a lawyer and take it up with the courts. Actually, I am a lawyer. I am a federal prosecutor, and this notice is fraudulent. HOAs cannot issue eviction notices in Florida. Only courts can do that through a proper foreclosure process. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Brenda spoke again, her voice had taken on a defensive edge. We have every right to protect this community from people who do not pay their fair share. Your mother has been living here for years, benefiting from all the amenities and improvements we have made. It is time she paid up or moved out. What amenities? What improvements? The HOA fee has been the same for 15 years. That is none of your concern. The notice stands. 72 hours. She hung up on me. I stood there staring at my phone, absolutely certain now that this was more than just aggressive HOA management. This was a deliberate fraud scheme, and my mother was not the only victim. Over the next hour, I knocked on doors throughout the neighborhood. What I discovered was disturbing. Brenda Hutchins had been systematically targeting elderly homeowners with fake fees, threatening letters, and intimidation tactics. Mrs. Peterson, 81 years old, had paid $5,000 in special assessments 6 months ago after receiving threatening letters claiming her house would be foreclosed. Mr. Yamamoto, 77, had paid $3,000 for emergency repairs to common areas that never happened. The Johnsons, both in their early 70s, had been fined repeatedly for supposed violations of HOA rules that did not exist in the actual bylaws. Every single victim was elderly, lived alone, and was targeted with official-looking documents designed to create panic and compliance. It was a textbook elder fraud scheme, and I was going to make sure Brenda Hutchins paid for every penny she had stolen. Jennifer called me back 3 hours later with information that made the picture even clearer. Brenda Hutchins had moved to Florida from Arizona 18 months ago, right after being named in a civil lawsuit for embezzling from her previous HOA. The case had been settled out of court with a confidentiality agreement. She had somehow managed to get elected as president of the Lakewood Estates HOA 8 months ago, running unopposed after the previous president retired. More importantly, Jennifer discovered that Brenda had created a separate bank account under the name Lakewood Estates Community Improvement Fund that was not listed in any of the official HOA filings. Money was being deposited into that account regularly, but there was no legitimate connection to the actual HOA. "Marcus, this is a straight-up embezzlement and fraud operation," Jennifer said. "She is using her position as HOA president to create fake fees and assessments, then pocketing the money. Based on the bank records I can access, she has pulled in at least $80,000 in the last 6 months. Can you send me everything you have found? I am going to need it for tomorrow." "Tomorrow? What are you planning?" "I am going to pay Brenda Hutchins a visit at the next HOA board meeting, and I am bringing some friends." The Lakewood Estates HOA held its monthly board meetings on the first Monday of each month at 7 in the evening in the community clubhouse. That gave me exactly 1 day to prepare. I spent Sunday night drafting a detailed complaint and gathering evidence. By Monday morning, I had contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, the Florida Attorney General's office, and the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department. Everyone was very interested in what I had found. I also did something else. I contacted every single victim I could find and asked them to attend the Monday evening HOA meeting. I told them to bring their documentation and to be prepared to speak up. By Monday afternoon, I had confirmed that at least 23 households had been targeted by Brenda's schemes, with total losses exceeding $150,000. Monday evening arrived, and I drove my mother to the community clubhouse. She was nervous, but I reassured her that everything was going to be fine. When we walked into the meeting room, it was packed. Usually, HOA meetings attracted maybe a dozen residents, but tonight there were over 60 people crammed into the space. Brenda Hutchins sat at the front table with 2 other board members, a meek-looking man named Gerald and a younger woman named Tracy, who seemed uncomfortable with the crowd. Brenda was exactly what I had pictured. A woman in her early 50s with an aggressive blonde bob haircut, wearing too much makeup and a pantsuit that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." She had that particular expression that certain middle-aged women perfect over years of complaining, demanding, and bullying their way through life. When she saw the crowd, her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself and called the meeting to order by banging a gavel on the table like she was a judge. "This meeting will come to order. We have a very full agenda tonight, and I will not tolerate any disruptions. If you are here to complain about fees or assessments, you can schedule a private meeting with me during office hours." I raised my hand. "I have a question about those fees and assessments." She looked at me with barely concealed annoyance. "And you are Marcus Sullivan." "Dorothy Sullivan is my mother. You delivered a fake eviction notice to her house on Sunday." The room went silent. Every eye turned to Brenda, whose face flushed red. "That was not fake. Your mother owes this community a substantial amount of money, and we are simply following the proper procedures to collect it." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, pulling out a folder full of documents. "I am a federal prosecutor, Miss Hutchins, and I specialize in fraud cases. So let me be very clear about what is happening here. The eviction notice you gave my mother is fraudulent. HOAs in Florida cannot issue eviction notices. Only courts can do that through a foreclosure process that takes months and requires multiple legal filings. Your notice was designed to look official in order to intimidate an elderly woman into paying money she does not owe. I do not have to listen to this. You are disrupting an official HOA meeting. Actually, you do have to listen to this. Because I have been investigating you for the last 36 hours, and I have found evidence of a systematic fraud and embezzlement scheme targeting elderly residents of this community. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Gerald and Tracy both looked at Brenda with shock. She stood up, her face now purple with rage. This is outrageous. I am the president of this HOA, and I have done nothing but work tirelessly to improve this community. If some people cannot afford to live here anymore, that is not my problem. Really? Then explain the bank account you created under the name Lakewood Estates Community Improvement Fund. That account is not listed in any official HOA filings, but it has received over $80,000 in deposits over the last 6 months. Where did that money come from, and where did it go? Brenda's face went from purple to white in an instant. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. That account is for special projects. It is perfectly legitimate. Then why is not it listed in the HOA's financial disclosures? And why do the deposits correspond exactly with the fake fees and assessments you have been charging residents? I turned to face the crowd. If anyone here has received threatening letters from Miss Hutchins demanding payment for special assessments, emergency repairs, legal fees, or any other charges that were not listed in your original HOA agreement, please raise your hand. 23 hands went up immediately. Brenda looked around the room in panic. This is a coordinated attack against me. These people are just upset because I have been enforcing the rules that everyone else has been too lazy to enforce. Miss Hutchins, I have copies of the original HOA bylaws and covenants for this community. None of the fees you have been charging are authorized under those documents. You have been creating fake charges and pocketing the money. That is embezzlement and elder fraud, both of which are serious felonies. At that moment, the door to the clubhouse opened and 2 FBI agents walked in, along with a detective from the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department. Brenda's eyes went wide. What is this? You cannot do this. The FBI agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, stepped forward. Brenda Hutchins, we are here to execute a warrant to seize all financial records and electronic devices related to the Lakewood Estates Homeowner Association. We are also going to need you to come with us to answer some questions. I want a lawyer. That is your right. But we are still seizing the records. The next 30 minutes were chaos. The FBI agents and the detective collected boxes of documents from the small office attached to the clubhouse. They confiscated Brenda's laptop, tablet, and phone. Gerald and Tracy both looked shell-shocked, insisting that they had no idea what Brenda had been doing. Based on my conversations with them later, I believed them. Brenda had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom, making decisions without consulting the other board members and keeping the financial records to herself. Brenda was not arrested that night, but she was taken in for questioning. I went with my mother back to her house, and we sat in her kitchen drinking tea while she processed everything that had happened. I cannot believe she tried to steal my house, my mother said quietly. Why would someone do that? Agreed Mom. And she targeted you and the other elderly residents because she thought you would be easy victims, people who would not fight back or know how to navigate the legal system. Thank God you were here. Thank God Mrs. Chen called me. This could have been so much worse. Over the next week, the investigation expanded rapidly. The FBI discovered that Brenda had been running similar schemes at 3 other HOAs in the Tampa area, creating fake fees and pocketing the money. In total, she had stolen over $300,000 from vulnerable homeowners. The fake bank account was just the tip of the iceberg. She had also been submitting fake invoices for repairs and maintenance that never happened, paying the invoices to shell companies she controlled. The most disturbing part was how sophisticated her operation had been. She had created fake letterheads, fake legal documents, and even a fake website for a law firm that supposedly represented the HOA. Everything was designed to look legitimate enough to fool people who were not familiar with legal procedures. On Wednesday, I received a call from the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case, a sharp woman named Catherine Morrison. "Marcus, we are going to be filing federal charges against Hutchins by the end of the week. Wire fraud, mail fraud, elder fraud, and embezzlement. She is looking at 20 to 30 years if convicted on all counts." Good. What about restitution for the victims? That is going to be more complicated. We have located about $200,000 in her personal accounts that we can freeze and eventually return to victims, but the rest has been spent. She has been living way beyond her means, spending the stolen money on luxury vacations, designer clothes, and a new car. Of course she has. We are also looking at charging her with identity theft. She created fake invoices using the names of real contractors in the area without their permission. Those contractors are understandably upset. Keep me updated. I want to make sure my mother and the other victims get justice. Absolutely. And Marcus, good work on this. You probably saved a lot of people from losing their homes. The following Monday, Brenda Hutchins was arrested at her home and charged with 14 federal counts. The local news covered the story extensively, and it became a cautionary tale about HOA abuse and elder fraud. My mother was interviewed by several news outlets, and she handled it with grace and dignity, emphasizing that she hoped other victims would come forward if they were being targeted by similar schemes. The Lakewood Estates HOA held an emergency meeting to elect a new board. Mrs. Chen was elected president, and she immediately began the process of reviewing all the HOA's finances and practices. They discovered even more irregularities that Brenda had hidden, including unpaid insurance premiums and fake contracts for landscaping services. But the story did not end there. As the investigation continued, we discovered something even more troubling. Brenda had not been working alone. Her boyfriend, a man named Derek Walsh, had been helping her create the fake documents and shell companies. Derek was a former graphic designer who had been using his skills to create professional-looking fake letterheads and legal documents. He was arrested 2 weeks after Brenda and charged as a co-conspirator. The FBI also discovered that Brenda and Derek had been specifically researching how to target elderly homeowners. They had been using public records to identify neighborhoods with high percentages of elderly residents. Then Brenda would maneuver herself into HOA leadership positions where she could exploit her authority. The preliminary hearing was held in early April, and I attended to support my mother and the other victims. Brenda showed up in court looking very different from the aggressive, entitled woman who had terrorized my mother. She wore a conservative dress and minimal makeup, clearly coached by her attorney to look sympathetic. But when the prosecutor presented the evidence, including bank records, fake documents, and testimony from victims, it was clear that the case against her was overwhelming. Her attorney tried to argue that she had simply been overzealous in collecting legitimate fees and that any mistakes were due to poor record-keeping rather than criminal intent. The judge was not buying it. Miss Hutchins, the evidence presented here shows a deliberate and sophisticated scheme to defraud vulnerable members of your community. These were not mistakes. This was a calculated criminal enterprise. Bail is set at $500,000 and you are ordered to surrender your passport. Brenda could not make bail, so she remained in custody while awaiting trial. Derek, facing slightly lesser charges, took a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Brenda. His testimony would later prove crucial in securing a conviction. In early June, I received some good news. The FBI had managed to trace additional funds that Brenda had hidden in offshore accounts. Between the domestic accounts and the offshore money, they had recovered over $280,000. It was not everything, but it was enough to provide substantial restitution to the victims. My mother received a check for $2,300, which covered not only the stress and emotional distress she had suffered, but also compensated her for the time and effort she had put into helping with the investigation. More importantly, she had the satisfaction of knowing that Brenda would face justice. The trial began in September, 9 months after the fake eviction notice had been delivered to my mother's door. I took time off from work to attend every day of the trial, both to support my mother and because I wanted to see justice done with my own eyes. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. They showed the jury fake letterheads, fraudulent invoices, and bank records proving that Brenda had deposited checks made out to fake companies into her personal accounts. They brought in victims who testified about the threatening letters and intimidating phone calls they had received. They presented testimony from real contractors, whose names had been used without permission on fake invoices. Derek Walsh testified for 3 days, explaining in detail how he and Brenda had planned and executed the scheme. He described how they would research HOAs looking for vulnerable targets, how Brenda would get herself elected to leadership positions, and how they would create fake fees and assessments that sounded legitimate enough to fool people who were not familiar with HOA law. Brenda's defense was weak. Her attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated community volunteer who had made some accounting errors, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 14 counts. The sentencing hearing was held in November. My mother and 6 other victims gave impact statements, describing how Brenda's actions had affected their lives. My mother spoke with quiet strength about the terror she had felt when she received the fake eviction notice, the fear that she would lose the home she had shared with my father, and the betrayal she felt when someone in a position of trust had tried to exploit her. When it was Brenda's turn to speak, she gave a tearful apology that rang hollow to everyone in the courtroom. She claimed that she had been under financial pressure and had made poor decisions, but she never took real responsibility for the harm she had caused. The judge was not moved. Miss Hutchins, you engaged in a deliberate and sophisticated criminal enterprise that targeted some of the most vulnerable members of our community. You exploited your position of trust within the HOA to steal from people who believed they were fulfilling their obligations as good neighbors. You created fake legal documents designed to terrify elderly people into giving you money they did not owe. The harm you have caused goes beyond the financial losses. You have destroyed people's sense of security in their own homes and their trust in community institutions. The judge sentenced Brenda to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims, including compensation for emotional distress. Derek received 8 years for his role in the scheme. As I walked out of the courthouse that day with my mother, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The system had worked the way it was supposed to. A predator who had targeted vulnerable people had been caught, prosecuted, and punished. The victims had received justice and at least some financial compensation. But I also felt a lingering anger about how close Brenda had come to succeeding. If I had not been a federal prosecutor with the knowledge and resources to investigate her scheme, my mother might have paid that $17,000 out of fear of losing her home. She might have emptied her savings account or taken out a reverse mortgage to come up with the money. And Brenda would have moved on to the next victim, emboldened by her success. That realization led me to take action beyond just this one case. I worked with the Florida Attorney General's office to develop new regulations and oversight mechanisms for HOAs. We created requirements for regular financial audits, mandatory disclosure of all fees and assessments, and stricter penalties for HOA board members who engaged in fraud or abuse of power. I also started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped elderly residents understand their rights when dealing with HOAs. I gave presentations at senior centers throughout Tampa, teaching people how to recognize fraud schemes and what to do if they were targeted. My mother came with me to many of these presentations, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak up if something did not seem right. The Lakewood Estates HOA thrived under Mrs. Chen's leadership. She implemented transparent financial practices, regular community meetings where all residents were encouraged to participate, and reasonable enforcement of legitimate rules. The monthly fees stayed at $150, and every penny was accounted for in publicly available financial statements. My mother continued to live in her house, which she now owned free and clear with no threats hanging over her head. She returned to her routine of baking cookies for neighbors and volunteering at the library. But she also became an advocate for other elderly residents, serving on a county task force focused on preventing elder fraud. One afternoon, about a year after Brenda's sentencing, I stopped by my mother's house for our weekly lunch. As we sat on her back porch eating sandwiches and watching the birds at her feeder, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Marcus, I have been thinking about what happened with Brenda." "What about it?" I was so scared when she gave me that fake eviction notice. For those few hours before you got there, I genuinely believed I was going to lose my home. I felt helpless and stupid and alone. "Mom, you are none of those things. I know that now. But in that moment, I felt like I had no power and no options. And that is what Brenda was counting on. She wanted us to feel that way because it made us easier to control. That is how predators operate. They isolate their victims and make them feel like they have no choice but to comply. But the thing is, we did have power. We had the power to ask questions, to demand proof, to talk to our neighbors and realize we were not alone. And most importantly, we had the power to call someone who could help. I had you, and that made all the difference. I am glad Mrs. Chen called me when she did. Me too. But what about all the people who do not have a son who is a federal prosecutor? Who do they call? It was a good question, and it led to another project. I worked with the legal aid organization to create a hotline specifically for HOA-related issues. It was staffed by volunteer attorneys who could provide basic legal advice and help people determine whether they were being scammed or treated unfairly. We promoted the hotline through senior centers, community groups, and social media. In the first year, the hotline received over 3,000 calls. About 60% were from people who had legitimate concerns about HOA overreach or potential fraud. We were able to help many of them resolve their issues without going to court, simply by providing them with accurate information about their rights and drafting letters on their behalf to the HOAs in question. But we also uncovered several other fraud schemes similar to Brenda's operation. In one case, an HOA treasurer in Fort Myers had been embezzling funds for 5 years by creating fake maintenance contracts. In another case, an HOA president in Orlando had been charging residents for improvements to common areas and then pocketing the money without making the improvements. Each case was reported to the appropriate authorities, and prosecutions followed. The work was satisfying in a way that my regular federal cases were not. Do not get me wrong, I loved being a prosecutor and putting away white-collar criminals. But there was something particularly meaningful about helping people like my mother, ordinary folks who were just trying to live their lives in peace, and who had been targeted by someone they should have been able to trust. 3 years after the fake eviction notice incident, I was invited to speak at a national conference on HOA governance in Washington, D.C. I told my mother's story and explained how HOAs could become breeding grounds for fraud if proper oversight and transparency were not maintained. The speech was well received, and several states reached out afterward asking for help implementing similar reforms to what we had done in Florida. During that conference, I met an attorney from Arizona who told me something interesting. After Brenda's case made national news, her previous victims in Arizona had come forward, and sued the HOA that had settled her earlier embezzlement case. They argued that the confidentiality agreement had allowed Brenda to move to Florida and victimize more people, and that the HOA had been negligent in not reporting her actions to law enforcement. The case was settled for a substantial amount, and it set a precedent that HOAs could be held liable if they covered up criminal actions by board members. That summer, my mother celebrated her 76th birthday with a big party in her backyard. Mrs. Chen was there, along with dozens of other neighbors from Lakewood Estates. Many of them were people who had been victims of Brenda's schemes, and they all shared a bond forged through that shared experience and their collective fight for justice. As I stood there watching my mother laugh and chat with her friends, I thought about how differently things could have turned out. If she had not had meticulous financial records, if Mrs. Chen had not called me immediately, if I had not had the knowledge and resources to investigate Brenda's operation, my mother might have lost everything. But she had not lost anything. Instead, she had become a voice for other vulnerable people and an advocate for transparency and accountability in community governance. She had turned a terrifying experience into an opportunity to make positive change. A few weeks after the party, I got a call from Catherine Morrison, the assistant U.S. attorney who had prosecuted Brenda's case. "Marcus, I thought you would want to know that we just received notification from the Bureau of Prisons. Brenda Hutchins tried to run a scam inside the prison." "You are kidding." "Nope. She apparently tried to convince other inmates to give her money for a fake prison commissary investment scheme. She told them she had connections on the outside who could get them better rates on commissary items if they pooled their money together." "What happened?" "One of the inmates she approached was a former accountant who was serving time for tax evasion. The woman immediately recognized it as a scam and reported Brenda to the guards. Brenda lost all her good time credits and was moved to a higher security facility." I could not help but laugh. Some people never learn. Apparently not, but it does mean she will be serving her full sentence with no possibility of early release. That conversation reinforced something I had always believed. People like Brenda Hutchins were not just greedy, they were fundamentally broken in some way that made them incapable of honest interaction with others. They saw every relationship as an opportunity for exploitation, every system as a potential mark. Prison was exactly where Brenda needed to be. As the years passed, I continued my work as a federal prosecutor, while also maintaining my involvement with the HOA reform initiatives and the legal aid hotline. My mother remained active in the community, serving on the county elder fraud task force and speaking regularly at senior centers about her experience. The reforms we had pushed for in Florida became models for other states. More than 20 states adopted similar requirements for HOA financial transparency and oversight. The National HOA Industry Association updated its best practices guidelines to include specific protections against fraud and abuse. It was not a perfect solution. There would always be bad actors looking for ways to exploit others, but it was progress. One evening, about 5 years after the fake eviction notice incident, I was having dinner with my mother at her favorite restaurant when she said something that stuck with me. "You know, Marcus, in a weird way, I am almost grateful for what Brenda did." I looked at her in surprise. Grateful? Not grateful that it happened, obviously, but grateful for what came out of it. I have met so many wonderful people through the advocacy work. I have learned so much about legal systems and community governance, and I have had the satisfaction of knowing that our experience helped prevent the same thing from happening to countless other people. That is a very healthy way to look at it. I am old enough to know that you cannot control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. Brenda tried to make me a victim, but instead I became an advocate. She tried to take my power away, but instead I found power I did not know I had. Dad would be proud of you. He would be proud of both of us. We clinked our wine glasses together, and I felt a wave of gratitude for my mother's resilience and strength. She had faced a terrifying situation with courage and had come out the other side stronger and more determined. The Lakewood Estates HOA continued to function smoothly under ethical leadership. The community thrived, property values increased, and residents felt secure in their homes. It was proof that HOAs could work well when run by people with integrity who genuinely cared about their neighbors. Derek Walsh was released from prison after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence. I heard through the grapevine that he moved back to his hometown in Ohio and was working as a night manager at a grocery store. He had been required to pay restitution as part of his sentence, and he was making regular payments on a court-ordered schedule. Unlike Brenda, Derek seemed to have genuinely learned from his mistakes and was trying to rebuild his life in an honest way. Brenda, on the other hand, remained incarcerated and would be for many years to come. I checked on her status occasionally, more out of professional curiosity than any personal interest. She had accumulated multiple disciplinary violations in prison, mostly for trying to run various scams on other inmates and prison staff. Each violation added time to her sentence and moved her farther from any possibility of early release. In year 7 after the incident, I was promoted to Senior Litigation Counsel in the U.S. Attorney's Office. The promotion came with more responsibility and higher-profile cases, but I made sure to maintain my involvement with the HOA reform work and the legal aid hotline. Those projects had become too important to me personally to let them go. My mother turned 80 that year, and we threw a big celebration at the Lakewood Estates Community Clubhouse. The irony of celebrating in the same place where I had confronted Brenda years earlier was not lost on anyone. Mrs. Chen gave a toast in which she joked that the clubhouse had been cleansed of evil spirits and was now a place of community and joy rather than intimidation and fraud. During the party, I watched my mother surrounded by friends and neighbors, all of whom treated her with genuine affection and respect. She was happy, healthy, and secure in her home. She had everything Brenda had tried to take from her, and she had gained so much more through the process of fighting back. A reporter from the Tampa Bay Times attended the party and interviewed my mother about her experience and the work she had done since then. The resulting article was published in the Sunday edition with the headline, "From Victim to Victor: How One Elderly Woman Fought Back Against HOA Fraud and Changed the System." The article went viral, being shared thousands of times on social media and picked up by news outlets across the country. The publicity led to more speaking invitations for both my mother and me. We traveled together to conferences and events in different states, sharing our story and advocating for stronger protections for homeowners. It became a bonding experience for us, spending time together on these trips and working toward a common goal. One of the most satisfying moments came when we were invited to the Florida state capitol to witness the governor signing a new law that strengthened penalties for HOA fraud and required annual training for all HOA board members on their legal responsibilities. The law was nicknamed Dorothy's Law by the legislators who had sponsored it, though my mother insisted it should not be named after her. "This is not about me," she told the assembled reporters and lawmakers. "This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. This is about protecting vulnerable people and ensuring that HOAs serve their communities rather than exploiting them." Her words were sincere and heartfelt, and they resonated with people across the state. The law passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, proof that protecting citizens from fraud was not a partisan issue, but a basic matter of justice and decency. As the years continued to pass, the impact of what had started with a fake eviction notice continued to ripple outward. The legal aid hotline expanded to serve multiple states. The reforms we had pioneered in Florida were adopted in various forms across the country. Awareness of HOA fraud increased, making it harder for predators like Brenda to operate undetected. My mother remained active and engaged well into her 80s, refusing to slow down or retreat from her advocacy work. She always said that Brenda had tried to make her feel powerless and invisible, and the best revenge was to be as visible and powerful as possible in fighting for others. I often reflected on how that one Sunday afternoon phone call from Mrs. Chen had changed so many lives. It had certainly changed my mother's life, transforming her from a quiet retiree into a nationally recognized advocate. It had changed my career trajectory, leading me to focus more on elder fraud and consumer protection cases. And it had changed the lives of thousands of homeowners across the country who benefited from the reforms and protections we had fought for. But more than anything, it had reinforced my faith in the power of speaking up and fighting back against injustice. Brenda Hutchins had thought she could terrorize my mother into giving her money because she assumed an elderly woman would be too scared or confused to fight back. She had been spectacularly wrong. The last time I visited Lakewood Estates before writing this account, I drove through the neighborhood and looked at all the well-maintained homes and neat lawns. Children played in yards while adults chatted with neighbors. It was a thriving community, exactly what an HOA should help create rather than destroy. I stopped by my mother's house, and we sat on her porch drinking iced tea and watching the sunset. She was 83 years old now, still sharp as a tack and still passionate about her advocacy work. "Do you ever think about that day?" I asked her. "The day Brenda showed up with the fake eviction notice?" "Sometimes. Usually when I am about to give a speech or talk to someone who is going through something similar. It helps to remember how scared I was because it reminds me why this work is so important. You have helped a lot of people, Mom. We have helped a lot of people. I could not have done any of this without you." "Sure you could have. You are the strongest person I know." She smiled and patted my hand. "I raised you to fight for what is right. I am glad you were able to fight for me when I needed it." As I drove home that evening, I thought about justice and accountability, and the importance of using whatever power and privilege you have to protect those who are vulnerable. I thought about how a single act of courage, Mrs. Chen making that phone call, had set off a chain of events that brought a predator to justice and changed laws across the country. And I thought about my mother, who had turned a moment of terror into a lifetime of advocacy, who had refused to let Brenda Hutchins make her a victim, who had found strength she did not know she had, and used it to protect others. The fake eviction notice that Brenda delivered that Sunday morning had been meant to intimidate and exploit. Instead, it had triggered an investigation that exposed a major fraud operation, sent 2 criminals to prison, recovered hundreds of thousands of dollars for victims, and led to significant legal reforms that protected countless homeowners. Brenda Hutchins had made a catastrophic miscalculation when she targeted Dorothy Sullivan. She had seen an elderly woman living alone and assumed she would be an easy mark. She had not known that Dorothy's son was a federal prosecutor with the skills, knowledge, and resources to take her down. More importantly, she had not known that Dorothy herself was someone who would turn fear into action and trauma into advocacy. In the end, justice had been served. The bad guys were in prison, the victims had been compensated, and the system had been reformed to prevent future abuses. It was the kind of outcome that restored your faith in the legal system and in people's ability to fight back against injustice. And it all started with a fake eviction notice delivered to the wrong elderly woman's door.